I became a load keeper because I believed in the completeness of the map. That is not as simple a belief as it sounds. The Vethara Cartographic Assembly does not produce maps in the way a surveyor draws a coastline or a pilot marks a current. We produce the concordance, the living record of all navigable space, updated in 8-hour cycles across 400 relay stations, maintained by 11,000 load keepers across 6 generations of service. The concordance is not merely a chart. It is the galaxy's memory of itself. Every inhabited system, every dead one, every corridor of cold drift between the spiral arms, it is all there, annotated, classified, cross-referenced. The steady accumulation of observation turned into knowledge, turned into the kind of certainty you can navigate by. The Assembly has been compiling it for 31,000 years. 31,000 years of patient, methodical work, and the slow accumulation of a truth that we believed, by the time I took my apprentice's oath, to be very nearly complete. I say very nearly, because there is one place in the concordance that has always been incomplete. I did not understand that when I took my oath. I was young, and the masters who administered the oath did not mention it, and the senior load keepers who oversaw my early training did not discuss it. It was not hidden from me. Nothing in the Assembly is hidden. The Assembly's foundational principle is that the act of concealment is a cartographic crime, because a map that hides a truth kills everyone who trusts it. A pilot who takes a ship into a corridor the chart has quietly cleared of its hazards does not get to argue at the inquiry afterward that no one told them. The chart told them. The chart was wrong. The chart killed them. We do not hide things in the concordance. It is the one rule that is older than any individual career and broader than any institutional preference, and it is not negotiable. But there is a difference between a thing being hidden and a thing being present in a form so self-contained, so thoroughly explained by its own existence, that no one thinks to explain it to a new apprentice. You do not explain to a child that fire burns. You let the fire be there, and the child understands, and the understanding is more durable for having been arrived at directly rather than handed down. That is what the Vethara null is. I discovered it the way most things of consequence are discovered, not by searching for it, but by inheriting someone else's unfinished work. Senior load keeper Tessavain Oral died in her 43rd year of service, which by the reckoning of our species was not an old death, but was not a young one either. She had been the Assembly's foremost authority on the outer marginal sectors, the regions at the galaxy's western periphery where the spiral arms thin, and the stellar density drops and navigation becomes an act of patience rather than precision. She had spent 2 decades mapping corridors that no one else had bothered to finish, establishing beacon reference points in dark stretches of space that the Assembly's older charts had marked simply as sparse and left at that. She was thorough. She was, by every account I ever heard from those who had worked alongside her, the most methodically complete cartographer in the Assembly's living roster. There was no gap she would leave unfilled. There was no annotation she would set aside for a later session. She had a reputation for staying at the notation table past the end of her shift, past the shift after that, until the entry in front of her was done and correct and cross-referenced, and she could close it with the confidence that the record was as full as it could be made. I knew her, of course, the way an apprentice knows a senior load keeper, well enough to understand her methods, not so well as to know her mind. She was not warm in the way that some of the older cartographers were warm, the ones who had been doing the work for so long that they had achieved a kind of fond ease with it, a settled comfort with their place in the concordance's long project. Tessavain Oral was not settled. She was present intensely, specifically present in whatever she was working on, with an attention that could feel, if you were sitting across the table from her, like a form of pressure. She noticed things. She noticed them in the way that made you want to go back over your own recent work and make sure you had been equally thorough, because you were fairly certain that, if you had not been, she would find it. She had taught me, In the 3 years before her death, most of what I understood about the practice of cartography as distinct from its theory. The theory is taught in the apprentice program, notation systems, survey methodologies, relay station protocols, the formal rules that govern how the concordance is compiled and maintained. What Tessavain Oral taught was the practice, how to read a source document for what it was not saying as much as for what it was, how to recognize the difference between a gap in the data and a gap in the understanding, how to know when an entry was truly complete and when it was merely closed. She made that last distinction frequently and with some emphasis. Closed means you have stopped working on it, she told me once. Complete means the record accurately describes reality. They are not always the same thing, and your function is to make sure they are. I thought of that distinction often in the months that followed, when I was trying to understand why Tessavain Oral, who had spent her career insisting on the difference between closed and complete, had applied it in reverse to Panel 31. When she died, her current project, a revised atlas of the Vethara Outer Reach, the westernmost fringe of our section of the concordance, was approximately 81% complete. I was her apprentice. By tradition and by institutional rule, the work becomes the apprentice's work. I spent the first 3 months after her death simply orienting myself to the scale of what she had left me. Tessavain Oral's atlas was not a single document but a layered system of survey records, reference logs, relay station observations, cross-checks against the Assembly's master files, and a series of personal notation journals she had kept in parallel with the official records, journals that were, by a strict reading of Assembly guidelines, informal and therefore not binding, but which I found to be more useful than most of the official documentation, because she wrote in them the things she was thinking rather than the things she had concluded. The official records show outcomes. The journals showed reasoning. I found her reasoning, as a rule, better than most people's outcomes, and I read them with the attention you give to a master's working notes when you are trying to understand not just what they did, but why they thought it was the right thing to do. The atlas was organized into 47 sector panels, each panel covering a navigable volume of space roughly 60 light-years across. 47 panels, and she had closed 40 of them, annotated, verified, cross-referenced, and submitted to the Assembly master files. 40 closed panels is a considerable achievement. The remaining 7 were in various states of progress, some nearly complete and needing only final relay checks, some still heavily annotated with open questions and pending source verifications. I could see from the density of her working notes which panels had been troublesome and which had gone smoothly. Most of them, even the difficult ones, had the quality that her finished work always had, the sense of a mind moving through a problem until it was resolved, leaving behind a record you could follow step by step. And then there was Panel 31. Panel 31 was the only panel in the atlas that was not in progress. It was not incomplete in the way the other 6 were incomplete. The others had gaps, missing data, open annotations, pending verifications, but they were visibly, actively incomplete, the way a sentence is incomplete when it runs out before the thought does. Panel 31 had no gaps. It had instead a single symbol. The symbol covered the entire panel. I stared at it for a long time the first time I saw it. It was not a symbol I recognized from the Assembly's notation lexicon, which contains several thousand standardized marks for every condition a surveyor might encounter: active stellar bodies, dead systems, navigational hazards, disputed territories, contested claims, quarantine designations, debris fields, dark matter concentrations, and approximately 900 other categories of cartographic fact. I had studied the notation lexicon for 2 years before being admitted to the Assembly's apprentice program, and I had continued studying it through my first years of active work, because the lexicon is a living document and there are always additions and revisions to track. I knew it well. I knew the marks that were commonly used, and the marks that appeared rarely, and the marks that were theoretically available but had, as far as I could find in the usage records, never been applied in an active chart. This symbol was not in any of those categories. It was simply not in the lexicon. It was a simple mark. Two intersecting lines, one vertical and one at a slight angle, crossing near the upper third of their shared length, with a small closed circle at the point of intersection. Clean and deliberate, clearly placed by a practiced hand. It was drawn on Tessavain Oral's panel, in the notation color reserved for formal designations, not pencil blue, not the amber of working annotations, but the deep burgundy that the assembly used only for entries that had been submitted to the master record and formally accepted. This was not a working mark or a provisional notation. This was a filed entry. Whatever this symbol meant, someone had decided it was the finished answer, and the assembly had agreed. Filed under what category, I could not determine. The symbol had no corresponding entry in any notation lexicon I could find. I searched. This is what load keepers do. We search and cross-reference and verify, and when a first search fails, we refine the terms and search again. I checked the current lexicon against the historical lexicons for every revision going back 12,000 years. The Assembly's notation system has been revised 41 times in that span, and each revision adds, removes, or modifies a set of entries. I checked all 41 revisions, working backward from the current lexicon to the oldest one I could access in the Assembly's notation archive. The symbol I was looking for appeared in none of them. I searched the Assembly's unusual notation registry, where non-standard marks that have appeared in submitted charts are cataloged and explained. The marks that individual cartographers invented for local use, or that appeared in charts from cultures the Assembly absorbed through treaty or expansion. I searched the master files for every submitted chart that included a notation in formal designation burgundy, cross-referencing against a symbol shape index that the Assembly's archivist staff had compiled for exactly this kind of research query. I found the symbol twice. Once in Tessavain Oral's panel, once in a document filed 3,700 years ago. I want to describe what it felt like to arrive at that result, because I think the feeling is cartographically relevant in a way that purely formal records typically cannot capture. I had spent 4 days searching, methodical, systematic searching of the kind that the Assembly trains you to do, moving through the available indices in order of likelihood, narrowing the parameters when broad searches produced nothing useful, expanding them when narrow searches missed obvious adjacencies. I was trained to expect that a notation in the Assembly's formal designation burgundy, filed in the master record, would have a traceable basis, a lexicon entry, a notation board ruling, a historical precedent of some kind that would allow me to understand what it meant. The absence of any such traceable basis, for a notation that had been accepted and filed and moved to the deep archive, was not something the training had prepared me for. It was not the most unusual thing I had encountered in 6 years of work. The Concordance's 31,000 years of records contain genuinely unusual things, and experienced load keepers learn to treat the unusual as simply a more demanding version of the ordinary research problem. But this was different from the usual unusual. The usual unusual is a case where the explanation exists but is harder to find. This was a case where the absence of an explanation had itself been accepted as the complete record, 3,700 years ago, by a governing body whose function was precisely to ensure that explanations existed. What the Assembly's notation board had accepted, in effect, was not a record but a refusal. Not a statement about the sector, but a statement about the limits of what could be said about it. And the board had determined, in whatever deliberation produced that determination, which I could not reconstruct because the board's meeting records from that era were not in any archive I could access, that the refusal was itself the complete record. I found this when I finally understood it to be either the most sophisticated piece of notation policy in the Concordance's history or the most troubling. For the first several weeks of my research, I thought it was the latter. The document from 3,700 years ago was in the Deep Archive. This was not a restriction. The Deep Archive is accessible to any loadkeeper who holds active guild certification, which I did. But it was not a routine location. The Deep Archive holds material that has been formally submitted, formally accepted, and formally determined by the Assembly's Notation Board to be complete, finished, closed, requiring no further action. Material goes into the Deep Archive when the record is done, when there is nothing left to add or revise. When the entry in the Board's judgment has reached the state that the Assembly's foundational principle demands, the full truth, accurately described, available to anyone who needs it. I submitted a retrieval request for the file. The request was approved in the ordinary automated way, with no special handling, no flag, no delay, no note from any archivist or notation officer suggesting that I think carefully before proceeding. Whatever the document was, it was not restricted. It was simply old, and it had the administrative designation that all Deep Archive material carries: complete. The document arrived in my queue 4 days later. I read it at the long reading table in the notation hall on the Assembly's 3rd level, under the overhead light panels where most of the apprentice research work is done, at a time of morning when the hall was quiet, and most of the other load keepers at work there were occupied with their own queries. I read it carefully. Then I read it again. Then I sat with it for a while without reading anything. The document was a formal notation entry, filed in the Assembly's master record by a senior cartographer named Daven Res, dated 3,712 years ago, covering a sector of the outer marginal region that corresponded, when I cross-referenced the coordinates, to the same volume of space that Tessavain Oral had marked with the symbol on her panel 31. It was a brief document, much briefer than I expected from a formal master record entry, which by Assembly convention should include survey methodology, data sources, cross-references, and full notation justification. Daven Res's entry had none of those things. It had a coordinates block, a date, and the symbol. And below the symbol, in the compact formal script that the Assembly's notation convention required for all master record entries of that era, a single line of text. The line read, Vethara null, no annotation required, no annotation possible, the record is complete. That was all. I sat with that for a long time. The notation hall continued around me, the soft sounds of others working, the occasional quiet exchange between colleagues across a table, the hum of the relay station update systems cycling through their 8-hour refresh. The ordinary sounds of the Assembly going about its work, building the concordance 8 hours at a time, making the galaxy's memory of itself a little more precise and complete with each cycle. In 31,000 years of the concordance, the Assembly's notation board had never once accepted a master record entry that contained the phrase, no annotation required. The entire purpose of the notation system is annotation. The mark is meaningless without the explanation behind it, without the survey methodology and the data sources and the cross-references that tell the reader not just what a symbol means but why the cartographer applied it here, to this sector, at this time. A designation without an annotation is not cartography. It is, at best, graffiti. At worst, it is a lie by omission, the kind of cartographic crime the Assembly's foundational principle exists to prevent, the kind of gap in the record that kills people who trust the map. And yet the board had accepted it, filed it, moved it to the Deep Archive with a complete designation. 3,700 years ago, some version of the Assembly's governing body had looked at this entry, 2 lines and a symbol that did not exist in the notation lexicon, decided it was finished, and put it away. And 3,700 years later, Tessavain Oral, the most methodically complete cartographer in the Assembly's living roster, A woman who had spent 20 years refusing to leave blanks in anyone else's work, who had a reputation for staying past the end of her shift until the annotation was done, had looked at the same sector, drawn the same symbol, and left it exactly as she had found it. She had not noted the Vethara null in any of her working annotations. She had not questioned it in her journals, at least not in any passage I had read in my initial review of them. She had simply applied the symbol and closed the panel. I went looking for Davin Res. This required more work than looking up the document, but the same principle applies. The deep archive is accessible, not restricted. Davin Res had been a senior cartographer who had filed a master record entry 3,700 years ago, which meant that whatever personal records, survey logs, and notation journals she had submitted to the assembly were in the archive. I spent 6 days pulling them. I say 6 days, but that understates it. The retrieval process for material of that age is not rapid, and cross-referencing the pieces against each other. The official survey logs against the relay station records, against the assembly's personnel files, against the notation board's acceptance documentation, required a kind of lateral research that I had not done before at this scale. I kept notes of my process as I worked, partly as a discipline and partly because I had the sense, early in those 6 days, that whatever I found was going to need a careful account of how I found it. I wanted to be able to reconstruct, if the occasion arose, every decision I had made and every connection I had drawn, so that the record of my research was as complete as the research itself. Davin Res had been a thorough cartographer. Her other entries, and there were hundreds of them, covering a long career in the outer marginal sectors, were precisely as you would expect from a senior loadkeeper of her apparent skill, dense with annotation, careful with cross-reference, written in the clipped professional register that the Assembly's most experienced practitioners develop over decades of formal notation work. She noted everything. She omitted nothing. Her survey logs read like the work of someone who had been trained, as I was trained, to believe that the act of noticing without recording was a small betrayal of the concordance, a trivial failure of duty that, multiplied across thousands of loadkeepers over thousands of years, was how maps developed the gaps that killed people. She was, in other words, exactly like Tessavain Oral, exactly like the person who had looked at her work and confirmed it. Until a specific survey date, 3,714 years ago, approximately 2 years before she filed the Vethara null entry. The survey log from that date was in the archive. I found it in the 3rd day of my search. I read it at the same table where I had read the null entry in the same quiet morning light, and I will tell you what it contained, because that is my function as a loadkeeper, to preserve the record, to maintain the annotation, to refuse the blank. But I will tell it the way a cartographer tells a thing, precisely, without embellishment, with full acknowledgement of what I do not know. Davin Res, 3,714 years ago, led a survey crew of 7 loadkeepers into the outer marginal sector that would later be designated the Vethara null. The survey was routine, a deep reach verification mission, the kind the Assembly dispatched periodically to confirm that long-standing relay station data on marginal sectors was still accurate. The sector had been mapped before in an earlier era, and the older charts described it as sparsely populated, a handful of unremarkable stellar bodies, low navigational interest, no inhabited systems on record. The survey's purpose was to verify or revise that characterization, update the relay data, and file a revised entry. Standard work. The kind of work that filled most of a senior loadkeeper's career without incident. They entered the sector on a standard approach vector. For the first 18 hours, the survey log reads as you would expect. Standard transit, standard relay checks, system documentation on the first 2 stellar bodies encountered, both as unremarkable as the older charts suggested. Notation of a minor navigational anomaly near the sector's inner boundary, a slight current deviation that the log attributed to an uncharted mass concentration and flagged for later verification. Davin Ress's voice in the log, where it appears in the crew chief notation fields, is level and professional. The crew was working normally. On the 19th hour, the log changes. Before I describe the change, I want to describe the quality of the earlier entries, because the change is most visible in contrast to what precedes it. Davin Ress's survey log, in its first 18 hours, is a model of precise professional notation. She is documenting a sector she has every reason to believe is unremarkable, and her language reflects that expectation, not bored, but efficient, covering the necessary observations without elaboration. The first stellar body, mass estimate, spectral class, orbital mechanics of its 2 satellite bodies, navigational hazard assessment, none. The second, similar treatment. The anomaly near the inner boundary, flagged cleanly, attributed tentatively, marked for follow-up. Her crew's relay checks, 3 of them at standard intervals, all nominal. She is a senior loadkeeper in a routine sector, and her log sounds like it. You can feel, reading it, the practiced ease of someone who has done this work for long enough that the documentation is as natural as breathing. It does not change dramatically. It does not break into alarm or distress. It does not record any specific event or observation that marks a clear transition. It simply shifts. The notation becomes less dense. The intervals between entries lengthen. Where earlier entries had been spaced approximately a quarter hour apart on average, the entries on the 19th hour onward are spaced between 2 and 5 hours apart, and some of them are very short. One entry from the 22nd hour is a single word, still. I do not know what they were waiting for. I do not know because the log does not say. This is the single most confounding element of Davin Ress's archive. Not that she saw something, not that the survey encountered some condition that altered its character, but that she, the most thorough annotator I have ever read in 31,000 years of the Concordance's records, chose not to record what that condition was. The log from the 19th hour onward documents the passage of time and, occasionally, the crew's navigation decisions, but it does not describe what they were observing. It does not describe what prompted the navigation decisions. It does not describe the conversations that 7 loadkeepers must have had over 11 days about what they were doing and why they had stopped noting things in the way that was their professional habit and primary function. It records, in essence, that they were there, and that time was passing, and that they were still. They remained in the sector for 11 days. The log from the 11th day's final entry notes a departure vector, a heading, and a fuel check. It is the most ordinary-sounding entry in the entire 11-day sequence, as if the preceding 10.5 days of near silence were simply a pause in the work and the work was now resuming. They left. That is all the log says. They decided to leave, and they checked the fuel and they left. 7 people had entered the sector. 7 people returned. I verified this against the Assembly's personnel records, cross-referenced against the relay station logs from the sector's boundary markers, which tracked vessel signatures on entry and exit. The entry log and the exit log matched. 7 registered signatures going in. 7 registered signatures coming out. The vessel itself, I cross-referenced the hull identifier, returned to the Assembly's main station 14 days after departure, consistent with the transit time from the sector's boundary. But here is the piece I could not find anywhere in the record. I want to establish, before I describe what I found, the methodology I used, because the methodology matters to what the finding means. I was not simply looking at a roster and noting absences. I was cross-referencing the survey crew's names against 6 separate record systems: the Assembly's active roster database, the Personnel Archive's career summary files, the survey deployment logs for the 5 years following the mission, the relay station registration records, which logged the vessel identifiers and assigned crew manifests for every departure from the Assembly's main station, the notation board's record of entries filed by individual cartographers, and the Assembly's mortality archive. 6 systems, cross-referenced. For any crew member who was present in 2 or more of those systems after the survey date, I considered them traceable. For any crew member absent from all 6, I considered them not traceable. Of the 7 crew members, I could trace 4 of them in subsequent Assembly records, completing further surveys, filing further entries, continuing careers that lasted, in most cases, another decade or 2 before the ordinary attritions of age and retirement. 4 of them went back to work and left no further trace of the survey except its entry in their service records, where it appeared as a standard DPreach verification assignment. I read all 4 of their subsequent records with some care, looking for any reference to the Vethara null sector, any notation or journal passage that reflected on the 11 days. I found none. Not an omission, in the sense of a gap where something had been removed, simply nothing. The 4 of them came back from the survey and went back to work and treated it, as far as the record shows, as a survey that had happened. 3 of them I could not find. Not dead, the Assembly maintains mortality records for all active loadkeepers, and their names do not appear in those records in the years following the survey. Not transferred, no transfer documentation, no resignation filing, no formal separation from the Assembly's roster. Simply gone. Present on the active roster before the survey, absent from it afterward, with no notation of any kind to explain the transition. The roster entries for all 3 of them end with the survey assignment. After that, nothing. The Assembly's records from that era are, by modern standards, sparse. I want to be careful here, because this is precisely the kind of observation that can be made to carry more weight than it should. I have spent some time with the question of what happened to the 3 missing crew members, and I have arrived at the honest answer, which is that I do not know and cannot know from the records available to me. I have 3 hypotheses, which I will state as hypotheses and not as conclusions. The first hypothesis is administrative loss, that all 3 crew members continued in some form of active life after the survey, and that the records documenting their continuation were lost in the ordinary entropy of 3,700 years of institutional history. This is the most conservative hypothesis and the most difficult to fully dismiss, because records do get lost. The second hypothesis is voluntary departure, that all 3 crew members chose to leave the Assembly after the survey, perhaps to seek a different kind of life, perhaps because whatever they had spent 11 days in the presence of had altered their relationship to the particular form of ordered knowledge gathering that the Assembly represented. That they went somewhere and continued, but the records of their going are not in any system I have access to. The third hypothesis is the one I find myself returning to despite its resistance to documentation, that what the 3 crew members encountered in the sector, more closely or more directly than the 4 who returned to work, was not compatible with the ordinary continuation of the kind of person who sits at a notation table and compiles relay station data. Not that it harmed them, not that it destroyed them or took them or kept them, but that a very old awareness, looking at 7 small beings in a small vessel, might see 7 individuals with different relationships to what it was choosing to show them, and that those different relationships might produce different outcomes on departure. 4 of them came back and continued. 3 of them came back and did not. Perhaps the difference was in what they were capable of seeing. I do not know. I have noted all 3 hypotheses, and I have noted my uncertainty about which is correct, because that uncertainty is part of the record. A loadkeeper who presents a conclusion without noting the uncertainty behind it is not producing a complete record. They are producing a confident one, and confidence and completeness are not the same thing. The Assembly's records from that era are, by modern standards, sparse. Records were lost in the ordinary course of institutional history, fires, relocations, data system failures, the simple entropy of an organization maintaining files across thousands of years without a perfect chain of custody. It is possible that all three disappearances from the roster are administrative artifacts, documentation that existed and was lost, records that were never created because the administrative systems of 3,700 years ago had different requirements than the current ones. I noted all of these as legitimate possibilities. But I also noted that the 4 crew members who went back to work were all present in the subsequent records in a way that suggested continuity of administrative documentation. Their service records connected forward without gaps. If the documentation systems of that era were incomplete, the incompleteness did not seem to affect them equally. The 3 who disappeared from the roster did so specifically and cleanly, as if a line had been drawn. I continued looking. What I found next was in Davin Ress's personal notation journals, not the official survey logs which I had already read, but the parallel personal journals she had kept alongside her official work, the way Tessavain Oral had kept hers, the way many experienced loadkeepers do. These are informal records, not binding, not submitted to the Assembly's master files as primary documentation. They are the record of what a cartographer was thinking, not what she had concluded. The distinction matters, as I have said, because thinking is often closer to the truth than concluding. Davin Ress's journals were almost entirely absent from the archive for the 2-year period between the survey and the filing of the Vethara null entry. I want to be careful about what I mean by almost entirely. There were, in the archive, 3 journal entries from those 2 years. 3, where her pre-survey journals had averaged roughly 40 entries per year. 3 entries in 24 months from a person who had kept detailed parallel journals alongside her official documentation for the entire length of her career up to that point. The first of the 3 entries was dated approximately 3 weeks after the survey's completion, and it was brief and oblique in a way that her earlier journals never were. It noted that she had returned to station, that she had reviewed the preliminary survey documentation with the crew, and that she was taking personal leave before resuming active work. That was the complete entry. No reflection on the survey, no note about the sector or what they had encountered, no mention of the 3 crew members whose names would subsequently vanish from the Assembly's roster. Just, returned to station, reviewed documentation, taking personal leave. The second entry was dated 8 months later. It was one line, "I have been reading," no indication of what she had been reading. The third was dated 6 months after that, 14 months before the null filing. It read, "I understand now why the older designation was not revised. The older designation was, by my reconstruction, a reference to the pre-Davin Ress survey that had described the sector as unremarkable, the survey whose characterization her mission had been dispatched to verify or revise." She understood, after 14 months of whatever she had been doing, why that characterization had not been revised by whoever had surveyed the sector before her. Whatever was in the sector had apparently been there long enough that multiple survey generations had encountered it and chosen, each time, not to describe it. Then no more journals for another 8 months until the null filing. Not missing, absent. There is a distinction, cartographically. Missing material leaves a gap in a sequence, an index entry pointing to something that is not there, a placeholder that acknowledges the absence and leaves a record of it. Absent material is simply not indexed. The 2 years of Davin Ress's life between the survey and the null filing do not appear in the archive index. There are no entries to retrieve and no placeholders to indicate that entries once existed. The journals from the 12 months before the survey are present and dense with her ordinary working observations, the notation decisions, the cross-reference problems, the small professional satisfactions and frustrations that fill a working loadkeeper's journals over decades of service. Then the survey. Then 2 years of nothing. Then the Vethara null entry, filed and accepted and complete. I noted this as I noted everything, and I continued. The last thing I found was not in the archive at all. It was in Tessavain Oral's journals. I had read her journals early in my orientation to the Atlas, skimming them for context on her working method before settling into the formal annotation records. I had noted at the time that her journals were thorough and useful, and I had proceeded with the formal documentation, treating the journals as background context rather than primary research material. But after 6 weeks of working through the Vethara Null's history, I went back to the journals and read them more carefully, from the beginning of her work on the Vethara Outer Reach Atlas, looking for any mention of Panel 31, any note she had made when she encountered the symbol, and decided to close it without annotation. I found one entry. It was dated 14 months before she died, at a point in her work on the Atlas when she would have been working on the sectors adjacent to Panel 31, approaching it from the edges, as was her method, completing the surrounding context before finalizing the central panel. The entry was short. Tessavain Oral, who wrote long journals, who had made a professional habit of recording the process as well as the outcome, wrote this one in 8 lines. It read, "I have been to the Assembly's archive today and read the Davin Res file. I have looked at the survey log from the sector. I have read the null entry and the board's acceptance documentation. I have thought about it for the better part of a day. I will close the panel with the symbol and I will not annotate it. I am not doing this because I have been told to. I am doing this because I understand now why Davin Res did not annotate it. The record is complete. It has been complete for 3,700 years. I am not going to be the one to make it less complete by adding something to it that does not need to be there. Whatever is in that sector already knows we know it is there. That is enough of a relationship." I read this entry 3 times. The phrase that stopped me was not the one about the record being complete, though I have thought about that phrase more than any other in the month since I read it. The phrase that stopped me was the last sentence. Whatever is in that sector already knows we know it is there. I have been a load keeper for 6 years. In 6 years, I have processed several thousand notation entries, cross-referenced several hundred archive documents, and worked with dozens of senior cartographers in the ordinary course of my training and my assigned work. I have read a great many documents in that time. I have read careful, measured, professional accounts of unusual conditions and unexpected discoveries, the quiet surprises that a galaxy of this size and age generates in the ordinary course of its existence. I have never read, in any professional document, the kind of language that Tessavain Oral used in that journal entry. Already knows we know it is there. That is not cartographic language. That is not the language of a notation system or a survey log or a relay station report. It is the language of a load keeper describing an awareness that runs in the other direction, not the observer documenting the observed, but the observed watching the observer with something that at minimum resembles recognition and at maximum resembles assessment. The sector was aware of the assembly. I want to be precise here, because precision is what I have. I do not know what Tessavain Oral read in the Davin Res file that led her to that conclusion. The file I read, the formal survey log and the null entry, did not, in my reading of it, explicitly establish an awareness. It established a silence, an incompleteness, a set of absences that I could note but could not fully interpret. The 11 days of near silence in Davin Res's log do not tell me what the crew was experiencing. The 3 missing crew members do not tell me anything about what they saw or why they did not come back to work. Whatever had moved the Assembly's notation board 3,700 years ago to accept a 2-line entry as complete, I could not reconstruct that reasoning from the documents I had. But Tessavain Oral had read the same documents, and she had arrived at certainty in the better part of a day. Whatever clarity the file gave her, it gave it quickly. She was not uncertain about what she had found. She was not troubled by it or frightened or moved to ask someone else's opinion before making her decision. She understood, and she acted on the understanding, and she wrote it down in 8 lines. She was not afraid. That is the other thing I noted about the journal entry, and I have come back to it often. The entry does not read as the writing of a frightened person. It reads as the writing of a person who has understood something and whose understanding has settled into a kind of clarity that is not quite peace, but is close to it. The clarity that comes when a long, open question resolves into an answer that is stranger than you expected but simpler, and the strangeness and the simplicity turn out to be the same thing. She does not say, "I will not annotate the sector because it is dangerous." She does not say, "I have been warned away, or the risk is too great, or some authority has told me to leave it alone." She says, "The record is complete." She says, "The sector knows." She says, "That is enough of a relationship." I have spent a long time with that word, relationship. In the notation system, relationship refers to the formal connection between a mapped object and its surrounding context. The gravitational relationship of a stellar body to its neighbors, the navigational relationship of a waypoint to the corridors that pass through it, the administrative relationship of a survey record to the master file it feeds. To say that the sector has a relationship with the assembly is to say that the sector occupies a position in the concordance's network of known things, that it is connected to everything else by the fact of its being known, the way every documented location is connected to every other through the common reference frame of the map. What Tessavain Oral was saying, I think, was that the Vethara null's position in that network was already fully established, that it did not need annotation because its relationship to the rest of the concordance was already completely defined, not by our knowledge of it, but by its knowledge of us. It was in the concordance the way a warden is in a building, not as a feature to be documented, but as a presence that has been aware of the documentation from the beginning, that knows the map exists, that knows its own position on the map, and that has been making decisions about that knowledge for 3,700 years. The decision it appears to have made in Davin Ress's case was, let them go. 7 people went in, 7 came out, 3 of them did not come back to work. I cannot know whether what those 3 encountered in those 11 days was a trauma or a transformation, or simply an understanding so complete that the ordinary work of notating and cross-referencing and filing felt, afterward, like the wrong scale of activity. But 7 came back. They were let go. And whatever Davin Ress spent 2 years thinking about, in the journals she did not keep or did not file, at the end of those 2 years she produced 2 lines and a symbol, and the assembly accepted it. There are other places in the concordance like this, not many. I have found, in the months of research that followed my discovery of the null, 3 other sectors with notation patterns that suggest a similar history. A single sparse entry, a board acceptance with minimal justification, a long gap in subsequent survey allocations. None of them carries the Vethara null symbol exactly, but all 3 have the quality that the null has. The quality of an entry that says, in whatever notation language it uses, that the record is done, that further documentation would not add to its completeness but subtract from it. I mention this not to expand the scope of what I know. I do not know enough about those 3 sectors to make any confident claim about them, but because the existence of multiples suggests something about the galaxy's character that a single case cannot establish alone. The Vethara null is not an anomaly in the sense of being unique. It appears to be one instance of a category that the assembly has, without ever formally defining it, treated consistently across 31,000 years. Approach once, document what the approach yields, accept the result as complete, allocate attention elsewhere. This is, I have come to think, the assembly's oldest and most important institutional knowledge. Not stored in a formal policy document, not entered in the notation lexicon, not taught to apprentices in the 2-year training program. Simply present in the practice, in the accumulated choices of generations of notation board members who looked at a sparse entry with an unrecognized symbol and decided, on some basis that left no explicit record, that it was right. I closed the archive file. I returned to my workstation. I opened panel 31. The symbol was there as it had been there since before I was born, since before Tessavain Oral began the atlas that became my responsibility. Two intersecting lines, crossing near the upper third with a small closed circle at the intersection, drawn in formal designation burgundy. Accepted. Complete. I did not add anything. This was not a decision that came quickly to me, and I want to be honest about that, because the record should include the difficulty as well as the outcome. I became a load keeper because I believe in the completeness of the map. A blank sector is not a complete map, by any definition I was taught. An entry that says no annotation required and no annotation possible is not, by the standards of the notation system I spent 2 years learning, a satisfactory entry. I know this. I knew it when I first saw the symbol on panel 31, and I knew it through 6 weeks of research. And I still knew it when I sat down at my workstation and opened the panel and faced the decision that Daven Res had faced and that Tessavain Oral had faced. But I had also, in those 6 weeks, arrived at a different understanding of what completeness is. The completeness I believed in when I took my oath was a specific, bounded kind, the completeness of a map that accurately represents what the map makers can observe, bounded by their instruments and their survey methods, and the ordinary limitations of being a small crew in a small vessel in a large and only partially knowable galaxy. That kind of completeness is real and it matters. It is what the concordance is built on. I still believe in it. But there is another kind, which is the completeness of a record that accurately describes its own limits. Not a map that says everything, but a map that says precisely and honestly what it knows and precisely, and honestly what it cannot know, and why the boundary between those two categories has this particular shape. Daven Res's 2 lines are not silence. They are a statement about the nature of the sector and the nature of the assembly's relationship to it, and the statement is as complete as a statement can be. The sector knows we are here. We know it knows, and further notation would not add to that truth but distort it by implying that our standard tools are adequate to describe what is in the sector, which they are not. There is one more thing I want to put in the record before I describe what I did with panel 31. In the course of my 6 weeks of research, I found, in a personnel file from 3,700 years ago, cross-referenced against one of the 3 missing crew members, by a record link that the administrative system had preserved despite the absence of the crew member's subsequent roster entries. A deposition. Not a formal document. A deposition in the Assembly's old investigative convention. A recorded statement taken by an inquiry officer, preserved in the personnel archive as a procedural artifact. The deposition was from one of the 4 crew members who had returned to active work after the survey. It was brief. The inquiry officer's questions were not preserved, only the answers. The answers, as I read them, described the following: that the crew had entered the sector on a standard approach, that the first 18 hours had been unremarkable, and that at a certain point, described only as the 19th hour, which matched the survey log's internal record, the crew had become aware that something in the sector was aware of them. The deponent used that phrase, aware of them. Not that they had detected something, not that instruments had registered a signal, but that the quality of the space around the vessel had changed in a way that every member of the crew recognized simultaneously, without any member of the crew being able to identify a cause. The inquiry officer had apparently asked what that recognition felt like. The deponent's answer: like being looked at through clean glass by something very old that had been watching that particular stretch of space for longer than it could be asked about, and that had now noticed, with what seemed like mild interest, that we were there. Not threatening interest, not welcoming interest. The interest of a long-standing occupant for a transient visitor who had arrived in an expected way and was behaving in an expected manner. The deponent added, "We stopped our work, all 7 of us. We stopped our notation and our relay checks, and we sat with it. Senior loadkeeper Ress said nothing, and we said nothing. We sat with it for 11 days. On the 11th day she said, 'I think we may go now,' and we did." The inquiry officer had apparently asked whether the crew had been directed to leave or pressured, or whether there had been any communication. The deponent's answer, "No, there had been nothing of that kind. We were simply permitted to stay for 11 days, and then we chose to leave, and leaving was permitted. The thing that had been looking at us continued to look at us as we crossed the boundary, and then we were outside the sector, and the quality of the space changed back to what it had been before." The deponent had been asked whether they intended to file a notation describing this. The answer, "No, Senior Loadkeeper Ress will file the notation. We discussed it before we left the sector. She will file what can be filed. The rest cannot be filed." The inquiry had been closed with a notation, "No further investigation warranted. Personal leave approved for 3 crew members on medical grounds, duration unspecified. 4 crew members returned to active duty." I read the deposition once. I did not read it again. I noted its existence in my research annotations and did not transcribe its content anywhere except here, in this account, which is not a formal notation entry but a working journal, my parallel record, the way Tessavain Oral kept hers, of what I was thinking as I worked. I submitted my completion report for the Atlas this morning. 46 panels documented, verified, cross-referenced, and submitted to the master files in the state that Tessavain Oral would have submitted them had she lived to finish the work. 1 panel carrying the Vethara null designation, unchanged from its previous state, confirmed by the current loadkeeper as complete. The board will process the report. The concordance will be updated. The sector will remain on the survey queue and will, at some interval I cannot predict, be reallocated for a scheduling conflict I cannot anticipate, and the relay data will continue to age, and the symbol will continue to be what it has always been. The galaxy's clearest example of a fact that does not become more true with more documentation. Whatever is in the Vethara null sector has been there for at least 3,700 years. Possibly much longer. The sector was surveyed before Davin Ress's mission, in an older era of the concordance, and the older charts described it as unremarkable, and I have sometimes wondered whether the thing that occupies it was already there during those earlier surveys and simply did not show itself, or whether it arrived later, or whether it has always been there, and has always been watching the surveys pass through without making itself known, until Davin Ress's crew spent 11 days in the quiet and waited. I have also wondered, in the quieter moments of this reflection, what the Vethara null makes of the concordance. Whether it is aware, as Tessavain Oral suggested it is aware of the assembly, of the specific form that awareness takes, the relay stations cycling every 8 hours, the loadkeepers at their notation tables, the accumulated weight of 31,000 years of patient documentation. Whether it finds the project interesting, in whatever way a very old awareness finds things interesting. Whether it has been watching the concordance get more complete, year by year, sector by sector, with the patient attention of something that has been in one place long enough to watch projects reach their conclusions. If it has, then it has watched the concordance grow toward the Vethara null from every direction, watched the surrounding sectors get documented and cross-referenced, and submitted to the master files, watched the blank in the center remain blank while the map became more detailed around it, watched the assembly's notation board accept 2 lines and a symbol and call it complete, watched 7 survey allocations get transferred on scheduling conflicts for 3,700 years. And it has left the record standing. That is, I think, the most complete statement of the relationship that I can make. I cannot answer those questions from the records I have. I have noted them, as a loadkeeper notes open questions, and I will leave them in my working annotations, where the next loadkeeper who inherits this work may find them useful. The symbol on panel 31 does not require my attention. It does not require anyone's attention in the sense of needing correction or revision or elaboration. It requires only what it has always required: the recognition that it means what it says, that the record it describes is complete, and that the appropriate response to a complete record is to close it. I have closed it. The concordance has been updated. The record stands.